Hagar, the woman God saw. She was not a side character in someone else's story. We've spent 2 episodes with Sarah. We watched her pack her tent and follow a promise. We watched her wait. We watched her doubt and run ahead and laughed and finally hold her miracle. But there's another woman in that story. A woman we passed over quickly. A woman the text introduces in a single sentence. Now Sarai had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. One sentence, as if she arrived from nowhere, as if she had no past, no story, no self before the moment she became useful to someone else. She had all three. Her name was Hagar, and before she was Sarah's servant, before she was Abraham's concubine, before she was the woman expelled into the desert with nothing but a skin of water and a child, she was a girl in Egypt who had a whole life ahead of her. This is her diary. And unlike Sarah's, much of what you're about to hear lives in the spaces between the biblical lines. The scripture gives us the facts. What follows is the soul behind them. This is Hagar's story, told the way it deserved to be told all along. Entry 1. Egypt. Imagined backstory before Genesis 16. I grew up beside the Nile. I know people think of Egypt as pyramids and pharaohs and gods with heads of animals. And yes, all of that was true. But what I remember most is the water. The way the Nile moved in the early morning, slow and silver and certain of itself. My mother used to say that the river never worried, it just kept going. I've tried to be like the river my whole life. I've not always succeeded. My family was not wealthy, but we were not nothing. My father worked near the Palace District, close enough that I understood from childhood that there were people whose worlds were large and people whose worlds were small. I watched the difference every day. I was curious. I was quick. I asked questions that made my mother press her lips together and look away. I wanted to know how things worked, the irrigation channels, the market prices, the way the priest spoke of the gods as if they were personal friends. I had dreams, not grand ones. I was practical enough to know the limits of a girl's life in those days. But I dreamed of a home of my own, of children who would grow up beside the water and ask the same questions I asked, of a life that was mine to shape. I did not know then what the word servant would come to mean for me. I did not know that Pharaoh's palace, the place I had watched from a careful distance my whole childhood, would one day reach out and swallow me whole. But that is what happened. When the Hebrew woman came, the beautiful one, the one Pharaoh's men could not stop talking about, everything changed. Pharaoh took her in. Her husband received gifts, livestock, silver, servants. I was one of those servants. I was given, like a donkey, like a bolt of cloth. I was 15 years old. Entry 2. Learning to serve. Imagined Hagar's early years with Sarai. Sarai was not cruel in the beginning. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to make her a villain from the start, and that would not be true. She was a woman of great dignity and discipline. She ran her household with precision. She did not shout. She did not humiliate. She was also, I noticed this immediately, in pain. She wore it the way a woman wears a wound she has decided no one will see. She was always composed, always gracious, always the correct distance from the grief that lived behind her eyes. I was her personal maid. I dressed her, I prepared her things, I learned her routines, her preferences, the specific way she liked her evening meal arranged. I learned which sentences meant she wanted company and which meant she wanted to be left entirely alone. I learned her, And gradually, I hope, she learned me. There were moments, small ones. She would laugh at something I said. She would ask my opinion on a fabric, a recipe, a route between camps. She would sometimes, when the day had been long and the tent was quiet, talk to me as if I were a person rather than a function. Almost. I was grateful for those moments, and I was ashamed of my gratitude. Because I had not chosen this. I had not chosen her. I had not chosen the God her husband spoke to in the night, or the impossible journey they were on, or the land with no name they were walking toward. I had been handed to them like a gift that no one asked for. But I was here, and the river never worries, it keeps going. So I kept going. Entry 3, the conversation. Imagined, Genesis 16, 1-3. She came to me in the evening. I knew something was different immediately. She was too still. Her hands, always occupied with something, always moving, were folded in her lap. She said, "Hagar, sit with me." I sat. There was a long silence. Then she said, without looking at me, "The Lord has kept me from having children. You know this." I said nothing. We did not speak of it. We had never spoken of it. She said, "Abraham needs a son. The promise God made him requires a son. And I?" She stopped, pressed her lips together, began again. "I am asking you to go into my husband. If you conceive, the child will be considered mine. You will have given me something I cannot give myself." I sat very still. She was watching me now, and I saw it, just for a moment, the rawness beneath the composure, the years of grief compacted into one request. She was not asking lightly. She had waited, perhaps a very long time, before she could bring herself to say those words out loud. And still, did anyone ask what I wanted? Did she ask whether I dreamed of children, children I would carry, children I would name, children who would be mine? Did she ask whether the thought of going to her husband filled me with a fear or revulsion, or simply a bottomless sadness? She did not ask. She explained. She requested. She waited. And I thought of the river, of keeping going. Did I have a choice? Let me be honest with you. Writing this now from a distance I could not have imagined then. Legally, no. Culturally, no. Practically, no. I had no choice in any situation. But I was not a woman without dignity, and so I said the only thing I could say that felt true. I will do what you ask of me. Not I am glad, not I want this, just I will do it. She nodded. She said, "Thank you, Hagar." She'd never called me by my name like that before. It was the kindest and the cruelest thing she could ever have said to me. Entry number 4. Everything shifted. Genesis 16, 4-6. I did not expect to feel what I felt when I knew I was carrying his child. I had prepared myself for duty, for endurance, for the quiet dignity of a woman who does what is asked of her and feels nothing. But my body had its own ideas. Something in me, something old and fierce and entirely beyond my control, rose up like the Nile in flood season. I was carrying life. My body was doing what Sarah's could not. Now I know how that sounds. I know it is not generous. I know that Sarah's grief was real and long, and I watched it quietly for years. But I was 20 years old and pregnant, and suddenly, for the first time since I was 15, I felt like something other than a function. I felt powerful. And that power, God help me, showed. I did not plan it. I did not decide, today I will look at Sarah with new eyes. But something changed in the way I held myself. Something shifted in the space between us. She saw it. Of course she saw it. She was the most perceptive woman I had ever known. And it was destroying something between us that I did not think we ever fully repaired. I have thought about this many times since. My silent conversation with myself in the long nights of that season went like this. Somewhat. She gave you to me. She made this happen. You are carrying the child she asked you to carry. What exactly is she angry about? And then the quieter voice beneath that one. She is angry because she is still Sarah and you are still Hagar, and nothing about the order of this world has changed, except that your womb works and hers does not. And that one difference has undone her. I understood her. I understood her, and I could not stop myself from being exactly what I was. Pregnant, Egyptian, alive with something she could never feel. She went to Abram and she said, "The blame for this is on you." Abram said, "She is your servant. Do with her as you see fit." And then she began to treat me harshly. I will not say what those weeks felt like. I will only say this. I have survived being handed to strangers at 15. I had survived years of belonging to someone else's story. But there's a specific cruelty in being punished for something you were ordered to do. I reached a morning where I simply could not stay. So I ran. Entry 5, the desert and the God who saw me. Genesis 16, 7-14. I had no plan. I was pregnant, alone, Egyptian, and walking in the desert in the direction of home. A home I had not seen in years, a home I was not even sure existed anymore. I stopped at a spring of water on the way to shore. I was so tired. And then a voice. "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" I looked up. A man, though I understood immediately he was not only a man. I said, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." I did not dress it up. I did not explain or justify or minimize. I was running. That was the truth. He told me to go back. He said, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." I want to be honest. This was not what I wanted to hear. And then he told me the rest. He said, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." My descendants, not Sarah's, not Abram's, mine. He said, "You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael," meaning God hears, because the Lord has heard of your misery. The Lord has heard of your misery. Not, the Lord has noted your situation. Not, God is aware of your circumstances. The Lord heard my misery, my specific, personal Egyptian servant girl misery. He heard it and he named my son after it. And then, and this is the part I will carry until I die, I gave God a name. I said, "You are the God who sees me, El Roy, the God who sees." I said, I have now seen the one who sees me. No one had ever seen me, not truly. I had been given and taken and used and sent away. I had been 15 years of age, of useful and then suddenly inconvenient. But God saw me, not through the lens of Sarah's story, not as the instrument of Abraham's legacy. Me, Hagar, daughter of Egypt, alone at a spring in the desert. He saw me. I went back because the God who sees me had spoken. And when El Roi tells you something, you listen. Entry 6, Ishmael and the long wait. Genesis 16, 15 to 16, Genesis 21, 8 to 21. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. He held his son, this man who had walked with God, who had received promise after promise, and he wept. I watched him, and in that moment I felt something I had not expected to feel. Gratitude. Not for my situation, not for the years behind me, but for the child in my arms, for the fact that Ishmael existed, that he was real and warm and loudly, furiously alive. Sarah took him, as agreed, as arranged, as I had known she would, and I watched that too. I let her, because I knew something she did not know. El Roi had made me a promise. Ishmael was mine. Whatever else happened in that camp, whatever arrangements human beings made about ownership and inheritance, that boy carried my blood and God's promise. The years passed, 13 of them to be exact. Then Isaac was born, and the world of that camp rearranged itself completely. I watched it happen. I watched Sarah hold her miracle. I watched the joy move through the camp like a wave, and I felt, I will be honest, I felt complicated things. Joy for her, because even after everything, I knew that waiting had cost her. Fear for my son. I also felt fear for my son. At Isaac's weaning feast, Ishmael was 14 years old, a boy becoming a man. He did something that day. The text says he was mocking, and I will not defend what he did. He knew better. But I also know my son, and I know what is to grow up as the almost heir, the almost son, the one who was never quite enough once the real thing arrived. Sarah went to Abraham. "Expel this woman and her son," she said to him. Abraham was distressed. This was, after all, his son too. But God told him to listen to Sarah. And so one morning, early before the heat, Abraham came to me. He gave me bread and a skin of water. He placed Ishmael's hand in mine. He could not look at me. We walked into the desert. Entry 7, the well. Genesis 21, 14 to 21. The water ran out somewhere in the desert of Beersheba. I found a bush, and I put my son under it in the shade. And then I walked away. Not far, about a bow shot, just far enough, because I could not watch him die. I sat down and I wept. I had survived Pharaoh's palace. I had survived years of servitude. I had survived pregnancy and cruelty and exile and the desert the first time. I had heard God's voice at a spring and carried his promise back into the camp that did not want me. But I could not watch my child die of thirst. I said nothing to God this time. I had no words left. But Ishmael cried, and God heard him. The angel of God called to me from heaven and said, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened my eyes, and there, a well, right there, a well with water. I filled the skin, and I went to my son, and I gave him water, and I held him. I held him the way I had held him the first moment I understood he was real, that fiercely, that completely, that finally. God provided for Ishmael. He grew up in the desert of Paran. He became an archer. I, his Egyptian mother, the woman who had been handed to strangers at 15 and built a life from nothing, found him a wife from Egypt. My homeland, my people. I brought Egypt back to my son. Ishmael became the father of 12 princes. 12! The same number as the sons of Jacob. His descendants are numbered in the hundreds of millions today. Sarah had one son. I had a nation. Hagar is the first person in the Bible, not the first woman, but the first person to receive a personal visit from an angel. She's the only person in the entire Bible to give God a name, El Roi, the God who sees. She was an enslaved Egyptian woman used by people of faith to solve a problem their faith couldn't wait out, and then discarded when she was no longer convenient. And God saw her anyway, not because of who she was connected to, but because of whose story she was part of. Because she was Hagar, and she was sitting alone at a spring in the desert. And God does not pass by the people that other people pass by. If you have ever felt like a side character in someone else's story, if you had ever been used and then blamed for existing, if you have ever sat down in a desert and simply wept because you had nothing left, El Roi sees you. He saw Hagar. He hears the cry you make when you have run out of words. He opens wells in deserts, and he names the children born from your pain after the very fact that he heard you. Ishmael. God hears. Your pain has a name too, and it is heard. Next time we open a new diary, stay with us. If story moved you, share it, like it, subscribe to the channel if you have not subscribed as yet. There is a woman in your life who needs to hear that God sees her too. Scripture references are in the description. Until next time, when we open up another diary of a biblical woman.